Good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Nicene Creed, or the idea of whether or not this creed developed the idea of the quote Trinity, or the Godhead, as that's what the Bible describes it as, or the idea that Jesus is equal with God. I think that's the simplest way to put it. But as always, this is a live show. We appreciate any questions or comments. Our website, it's brought to you by North Columbus Church of Christ, and that website scrolling below me is northcolumbuschristians.com. There you can find out more about us there. We also put these videos on YouTube. The YouTube page is North Columbus Church of Christ. Now, the reason to bring this up, and you all might be wondering, but a lot of times this reference to the Nicene Creed, or rather this Nicene Council that happened way back in 325 AD, is, uh, you know, it could possibly be used to say, well, this idea of the quote Trinity was not developed until then. Uh, Catholic teachings may use this council to kind of beef up the supposed credentials of the Catholic Church, and they may say, well, this was a meeting of the Catholic Church, or something along that area, and maybe lend itself to the idea that the Catholic Church can, or and has been throughout history, developing doctrines. And so there's a lot of ideas surrounding this, and I think this question is similar to the idea, or the topic surrounding how we got the Bible. A lot of times you will see the Catholic Church defending the idea of saying, we brought you the Bible. And I can't remember if I ever did a lesson on that or not, at least here on Facebook. But the short, sweet answer to that is they didn't develop the Bible. The Bible was already in existence. Did they put all the letters together in one convenient book? Yeah, you could. I'll give them credit for that. But the letters definitely did exist before the Catholic Church, and it did not take the Catholic Church for an individual to figure out whether or not those writings were authentic, and get into this lesson here. But I think what we'll see is this is kind of the same idea here with the Nicene Creed. You may be saying, Evan, what in the world is this? I don't even know what that is. Well, as I've already stated, the Nicene Creed was a result of these meetings of church leaders in 325 AD. It's called the Nicene Council. I think they met some area of Nicene or whatever. I don't recall. But the reason for this was a response against Arianism. And basically, the gist of Arianism was that Jesus was a created being, that he wasn't equal with God, that he is just, I guess you would say, he is, when he is described as the Son of God, they would say, well, he is literally, I guess you would say, a son, and that being that he is a created being, and not, as this definition puts it, co-eternal with the Father. And they will also say that he was or was not of the same substance. There's this term that is used called consubstantiation, and there was this whole debate of whether or not Jesus was of the same substance as the Father. And so this Arianism says that he was not of the same substance, he was not equal with God, he was rather just a creature. So these people came together and to discuss this, and to develop ultimately this creed. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that many, if not all, of the Catholics, they recite this creed, I believe, at Mass, or very regular at the very least. And basically, it just says that God, or Jesus, was God, and the description of what he did. And you see here that he is consubstantial with the Father. Again, this is the only place I've ever seen this word being used. I had to look it up. But again, there was this big ordeal saying that he was exactly the same, of the same substance. And I don't, just looking through this, I don't really see anything that that I would disagree with. But again, there's this question of whether or not this creed developed this doctrine of the Trinity. And of course, I use that term Trinity because a lot of people understand what that means. But I think the best way to describe it, and the way the Bible describes it actually, is the Godhead. That we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're all equal. Now, don't know how all that stuff works, but this is how the Bible describes these three beings there. And so we're going to look and ask the question of, did this meeting establish this doctrine of the Trinity? And another thing with this is we see all of these church leaders, these bishops, and the high flute people come together and determine this doctrine. And another thing that we have to consider is, do these church leaders, bishops, popes, councils, when we may say these different church conventions that we have nowadays, are they the ones that determine doctrines or deem doctrines legit? Okay. And so we're also in the midst of all those other questions, and I think we'll shed some light on these other questions, is looking at how the early church viewed the teachings of the apostles. And we do have some writings outside of the Bible in which other people wrote, and how they considered, or at least how they looked at, the teaching of the apostles. And so this is kind of small here. There's a lot here. But this came, or a lot of this came from a book called Ecclesiastical History. It was written by a fellow named Eusebius Pamphilus, and I believe it was around the 3rd century in which he wrote this, I do believe. But he writes about these different heretical teachings, and these teachings that have been around for some time before the Nicene Council. Okay, and so we see these Ebionites. This would have been around the 2nd century. So this would have been what would have been 100 A.D. to 199 A.D. And then we have the 3rd century. So we have Arteman and this Paul of Samosata. So this would have been the 200s to the 300 A.D. And then we also had Gnosticism, and of course that was around, I believe, even during the time of John. So this would have been late 1st century. So these different doctrines had been around for a long time before the Nicene Council was even an idea. Okay, and so with that being said, and we see people rebuking these people for some time, they're setting up arguments against these individuals. And so what this means is that many churches and or men, they held a biblical view of Christ's divinity. And so these individuals that believe that, Christ was equal with God, they are rebuking these people. They're again teaching against these individuals for some time before the Nicene Council. Again, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, so hundreds of years beforehand. And so they figured out that these teachings were wrong based on the teachings of the apostles. Okay, and so you get into the 2nd and 3rd century, the apostles are not around, and so the way they develop their knowledge of the truth is simply through the apostles' letters and the gospels that were written during that time. And so what we then can imply is that they believed in the authority of the apostles' writings, the gospel writings, all these things formulated their view and the opposition for these different teachings. Okay, and so these people reading the letters is just they were doing just as the apostles intended. They intended for the letters to be circulated. Colossians 4 in verse 16. So this was written to the church at Colossae, and he says, "Now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea." And so this Colossian epistle was going to Laodicea, and apparently there was an epistle that to Laodicea that we don't have, but it was supposed to go to Colossae. So they were writing back and forth. The apostles were writing these to churches, and these letters were being circulated throughout these churches. Also, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 27 says, I charge you by the Lord that this epistle be read to all the holy brethren. And so this is not just for a select few. At the very least, this was supposed to be read in front of everybody there in Thessalonica. And I would say this would also mean that others outside of Thessalonica were to read this as well. And so these teachings were being circulated. People were reading this. We had individuals in the early 300s AD that were reading the Gospels, setting up a defense for the Gospels, understanding that there was a lot of these heretical teachings coming forth. And so we see here a quote. This was out of the book How We Got the Bible from Neil Lightfoot, but it was quoting from Justin Martyr, who wrote this book called The First Apology. And it says, about the middle of the 2nd century, a Christian writer, Justin Martyr, stated that on Sundays in the Christian worship assemblies, the memoirs of the apostles were read together with the writings of the prophets. Okay, so we see the letters of the apostles. Apparently, they had them during the 2nd century. They had the prophets, and this would have been the Old Testament as well. So they were reading all these things. They had them. Okay, so why would they read them? Okay, why did they think that they need to read them? Why did they get together and stated that Justin Martyr states that they were coming together for the purpose of reading these things? Well, apparently, they had to have thought that they were important, that they need to know them, that they were authoritative. And I think we can also see that if they're authoritative, that the Christian needs to follow these writings. Well, then those writings have to be, pretty legit. And so that would mean that these things are inspired, that they were viewing these things as from God too. All right. So we, again, was just setting up this evidence here that people were reading, studying the scriptures, know the scriptures in the, again, 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. Remember the Nicene Council? If you remember back in your school days, 325 AD, that would be the 4th century. Okay. So centuries beforehand, they were already reading, knowing the scriptures. So why talk about this history? Well, simply being is that we can clearly look at history and see that people already held a biblical view of the quote Trinity or the Godhead. That the Bible, they knew that the scriptures clearly taught that Jesus was God because that was what the scriptures said. And so this doctrine already existed. So the Nicene Council cannot have developed it, right? So they taught and fought against these doctrines long before this council even convened. So moving on, let's look at what the Bible has to say about Jesus. So looking at the verses, I think the individuals would have looked at to say that, hey, Jesus was God, that he was not just a created being, that he was not just a man. And another thing that we have is to point out that I don't believe I had before was that people held to both extreme ideas. That they would say, well, Jesus was just a man, but we also had these other people that would say, well, Jesus was God, but yet he was not man. That you basically, I guess, you would just see like a figure or a hologram, so to speak, of Jesus on earth. But it wasn't. He wasn't actually a man. That it was just kind of an image there. And so both views, both sides of the spectrum existed, but yet both of these are wrong. John 1 and verse 1 and in verse 14 as well says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And the Word, verse 14, became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So this is what John had to say about this, and I hope you understand that this word that he's talking about here is Jesus, and he does clear that up in chapter 1. But he says the Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Okay, so he's with God from the beginning. He was God, and it says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So he was God, and he became flesh. Romans 9:5 says, "Of whom are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, the eternally blessed God." So we have Paul here, Romans, calling Christ the eternally blessed God. And in John 20, verses 28 through 29, it says, "And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Notice what Thomas said here. He says, "My Lord and my God." Jesus doesn't say, wait a minute. Don't go that far. Uh, he doesn't correct it. Jesus, apparently he agrees with Thomas' description of him. But notice what he says, "Lord and my God," there in John 20. Colossians 2 in verse 9, talking about Jesus, Paul writes, "For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily." Pretty powerful verse there. The fullness of the Godhead. So that would mean that he is God, but he had it bodily. Okay, so this describes his divinity as well as his humanity. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 16 says, "And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory." That he was God manifested in the flesh. Doesn't get much more clear than that. And in John 8, verses 58 through 59, one thing that I think a lot of people point that when they're talking about Jesus, they will come up with the argument that, well, these other people were saying that Jesus is God, that Jesus never said that about himself. Okay, well, this next verse is pretty much contradicts that. And so Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And they took up stones to throw at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Notice what he says. He says, "Before Abraham was, I am." So he said he was before Abraham, but notice the wording that he used. He says, "I am." Why use that verse? Well, it harkens all the way back to the time of Moses and the nation of Israel leaving Egypt. And this is how God described himself. He described himself as "I am." Okay. And so the people that are listening to Jesus, they know what he is saying by saying the phrase "I am." All right. That he's saying that he's always existed. He's saying that he was God. He was there before Abraham. And the people, again, knew what he was saying. That's why they took up stones, because he's equating himself with God, and that was a no-no. But we see here Jesus claiming, "This is who I am." Also, Isaiah 7 and verse 14 says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Remember what Emmanuel means. That'll be some homework for you. Figure out what the word Emmanuel means. Okay. Isaiah 9 and verse 6, it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Okay. Notice this child. Who is this child? Well, obviously it's Jesus here. Anybody that's read the Bible, they know this verse here. And notice what his names will be: Mighty God, Everlasting Father. So again, uh, this is God. This is who we're talking about. Jesus was God, and he came in the flesh. He dwelt bodily. Isaiah 44 and verse 6, it says, "Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God." Notice again, the Lord, the King of Israel, his Redeemer. And this is what he says: "I'm the first and I'm the last." But notice also what it says in Revelation 1 and verse 8. Remember, this is Jesus talking here. He says, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, says the Lord, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Okay. So we may look at Isaiah 44 and say, well, nah, I don't know if that's, doesn't seem like that's necessarily talking about Jesus there. But notice the description of God here. I'm the first, I'm the last. But then we have here Jesus basically using the same language, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the first and the last. I am the beginning and the end. So again, pretty consistent theme, very similar, and we see the teachings in the Bible that Jesus, yes, he was God. And so these teachings about the deity of Christ existed before, during, and after Christ. Okay, it did not take the Nicene Creed to formulate this, and any group asserting doctrines or formalizing doctrines. And we see people do that. People develop these creeds, these formalized teachings, or whatever we want to call it. But the problem is if these things are of course, if they're legit, they're only formalizing things that are already established. Okay, and so you really can't take any credit for that because it was already there. I guess you just wrote it down and put your stamp of approval on it, and but that doesn't make it any better, and it doesn't make it any less official than when the day it was written. And so I hope this has been useful for all of you. I know it's a little bit different than what I normally do, a little bit of a history lesson, but the Bible clearly teaches of the divinity of Jesus. It was not some developed teaching by man 300 years after Christ. And any people that will say or use the creed or the council to kind of bolster and say, well, this is bolster their church and say, well, our church did this, that, or the other, and without us and without this church, y'all wouldn't have nothing to go on. Well, that's simply not true as well, because these teachings existed, and it didn't take a specific church. If all these different denominations, all these various churches, if they never existed, you still would have the truth, and that's what we all try to follow. But I hope this has been useful for y'all. And as always, this is going to be uploaded onto YouTube. And if you got any questions, comments after this, feel free to let those be known. But until next time, I hope that you all have a good day and a good rest of the week. Thanks.